Are you normal? Welcome to The Big Puzzle. In this podcast, we explore the subtle connections between science, religion, politics, economics, and history. One piece at a time, we unveil the big picture of this shared experience that we call life. First of all, we need to define what normal means. According to the dictionary, normal means conforming to a standard, usual, typical, or expected. But let's use a slightly different definition. Let's say that normal is how close you are to the average. Maybe you remember from high school when you studied statistics. You remember that curve that was a very particular curve that's called the bell curve. That curve represents a normal distribution or a Gaussian distribution. Maybe you remember that usually you analyze that curve by looking at the extremes of that curve and also the overall shape. Was it flat or was it very narrow? So those are important aspects that we need to understand. If the distribution is narrow, that means that the population is very homogeneous. For example, I think of Norway. So until very recently, Norway has very little diversity, little variance in their population. Everybody looked pretty similar genetically. They had similar living conditions. They had a similar culture, and everyone was very close to the average. You basically could look at anybody and pretty much tell that they were from Norway. The United States, on the other hand, has a very big variance in this population. It's very difficult to tell what is the average American. Is it a blonde person, a cowboy? Is it a basketball player? Is it a New Yorker? It's very, very difficult. There's so much variation in living condition, in genetics, even in culture, that makes that distribution, that normality, very wide. That's one of the reasons why the United States is called the Great Experiment. Societies that are very homogeneous, it's kind of easier to get along, to share, to live together, but is that possible in a huge country with completely different cultures and origins and population? And so far it's been a huge success, but that could change, and that's why it's so important to understand this concept of normality. So what about the details, right? So if you think about details in this curve, it's where the outliers are. Things that are not common and are far from the average. Sometimes they're called outliers or edge cases or extreme cases. And those are very important. Before we analyze the importance of the outliers and the normality, we should address something important. Normality doesn't mean goodness. Something is normal doesn't mean that something is good. Post World War I, it was normal in Germany to hate the Jews. Why was that normal? Well, because there's obviously a lot of reasons, but one of the most important ones had to do with the way that Germany lost the war. So they convinced their population and themselves that they were the strongest, most powerful army, navy in the world, that they were destined to win the war and bring all the pan-Germans into one huge society. And this was even before Nazism. Not surprising, those were exaggerations, and they end up losing the wars. How could they save face after that? Well, the way they did it was by saying that somebody had to treason them. They call it the stab in the back. And they blame the Jews for doing that. They say that the Jews were conspiring in the back, to make Germany lose the war so they could do whatever they accused the Jews of doing. By repeating that through propaganda, they normalized that hatred for the Jews. And that doesn't mean that before that people liked the Jews, but there's always, again, outliers. There's always people who would hate them for whatever reason, but now it was normalized. It was perceived as something that everybody was doing. And that brings a big problem, because if normality can shift around, how can we guarantee a society? We already talked a little about how did that normality change in Germany, but how does it happen in general? Because it's happened all over the place, all the time. Well, that happens through propaganda and indoctrination on one hand, or enlightenment and education on the other hand, and things that were considered abnormal or not normal, well, they become normal. Or the other way around. Sometimes, things that were considered normal many years ago, now they're considered abnormal. You might find yourself being called an extremist just by believing things that were normal probably 10, 20 years ago. You're not really an extremist, or maybe you are, but what changes not you is the normality. That bell curve has been moving out, and if you're staying in the same place, you become more and more less frequent, more and more departed from the average. Is it good for normality to change? Well, it depends. Sometimes it changes for good. Sometimes, things that people accepted as good, we finally figured out that it's not good, and we need to abandon that. Again, that's the education, the enlightenment side of the shift. You teach people why you were wrong, why things that were considered normal were wrong, and one clear example would be slavery. So for ages, all over the world, slavery was considered something normal. Nobody gave a second thought about that. England is the first one who made a strong effort, followed closely by other countries like the United States, to redefine that normality, to shift that normality. In some cases, through war, people had to die to allow that normality to change. That was a good change. We would need a better way to tell if something is shifting for good or for bad. I want to propose two other pieces in this big puzzle that will help us understand or determine if the shifts in normality are good or not. Those are science and religion. Science, for example, we can go back to the example of Germany after World War I. There started to be a lot of claims about the blood, the purity of the blood, basically the origin of Nazism. Those were completely disconnected from science. So there were zero facts that would back those claims. Right? So in that case, if German people would have been paying attention to science, well, they might have questioned some of the claims that were made against the Jews. Religion, on the other hand, gives a different perspective. Even secular people admit that religion sometimes is the repository of the moral values. They contain the accumulated knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. The thing about normality is that religion also gives a framework, an ethical framework, a moral framework that people use to determine what is normal and what is not. Why is normality so important? Well, think about what we're experiencing today, and think about the changes that we're seeing in society and the consequences that those changes are having. First of all, we need to understand that society is designed for normality. What is a society? Well, society is just a group of people that decide to self-impose some limitations in order to achieve common goals. Those self-imposed limitations are what we call laws. There are rules and laws that define what you could do or you couldn't do. The interesting part is that those rules and those laws actually come from what people believe to be normal. You cannot create a rule that applies to absolutely all cases. As a society, we might agree that nobody could take somebody that is not theirs without the permission of the owner. That is true. That is considered normal. Right? It's based on a normal behavior. In normal cases, you shouldn't go around taking other people's stuff without their permission. But what happens, let's say that somebody's dying and you need to take them to a hospital, and then you take your neighbor's car without his permission. Would that be considered breaking the law? Well, technically, yes, but that's why societies have their own processes and methods and systems that deal with the outliers. The judicial system is mostly dealing with cases where, we don't know how to apply the law because it's not a normal case. 99% of the time, yes, it's true, you shouldn't take your neighbor's car. But sometimes there are exceptions, and those exceptions have to be dealt one by one. And so all societies have their own way to deal with those exceptions. But remember, those exceptions were defined based on what was considered to be normal. So that is why it's so important to understand that society was built on normality. When you start shifting things that were considered normal, you create a stress in society. So these subsystems that allow to deal with the edge cases, they get overwhelmed. They can't process the sheer volume that they're receiving just because people are doing things that were not considered when the laws were defined, when you don't agree anymore on what is normal. So if I could leave you with some homework before we address the next piece, I would invite you to look around and look at what things are shifting, what things that were considered normal 10, 20, 50, or even 200 years ago are now considered to be wrong or abnormal, and see how those changes are creating stresses in society. Try also to look at these shifts in normality in your society from the point of view of religion and of science. What does religion have to say about those changes? Are they moral? Are they ethical? And what does science have to say? Are those changes based on fact or opinion? For me, it's so interesting now to hear more and more youth talking about, I feel this, I feel that. When I was younger, we would say, I think. Why are we departing from thinking to feeling? This is not only affecting the way we speak, it's affecting the way we reason. How? Well, we stop reasoning. And science is being strongly affected by that. And we will revisit this in the future. Finally, when somebody is arguing with you about politics, some legislation, some changes that they're wanting to make, think about, are the cases that are presenting normal or outliers? As we explained, you can't really build a society based on outliers. You need to have a system to deal with those outliers and to identify which principles apply to those limits, to those laws, and to determine if they were actually broken or just technically broken. So I see that happening more and more. And if you pay attention, I think you will notice it as well. We will be covering this in other episodes, so I don't want to go too far into this. But think about it. They want to do some changes in immigration. Are they talking about the bulk of the problem, the 99%, or are they talking about very specific outliers? Anything that has to do with changes in economy. Are they talking about things that would benefit 99%, or are they always talking about that extreme 1% that is not represented? You cannot create laws for absolutely every possible case. Laws have to be decided, have to be defined to deal with normal cases. And if they don't work. You don't have a law. If a law has to consider all the infinite possibilities, well, that means that you don't have a law. It doesn't work at all. Which other pieces connect to this one? Well, there are many. This is not just bidimensional puzzle. Each piece can connect to probably hundreds of others. And we will be revisiting this, the concept of normality. For instance, when we're talking about the Second Amendment of the Constitution in the United States, so the right to bear arms, and how the positions are presented in such a way that it just focuses on outliers and not on the normal cases, right? And that could lead to making wrong decisions and basically losing all the benefits that amendment brings to absolutely everybody in this country, just to try to address a few edge cases that definitely should be address differently. That's just as a teaser. I don't know what we're going to be talking about that, but if you want to give some thought, maybe it could be useful for when we meet again. Well, that's everything I have for today. I hope you learned something, or at least you got a different point of view about some of these things. The whole purpose of these episodes is to think, to see things differently, to gain new perspective, and to find hidden connections. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope to see you next time.